Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. We talk about 5 scary encounters with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or what other people thought was a wild animal in the woods. These include finding footprints in the winter and having rocks and logs thrown at you. Let's start. First, I was born in Oklahoma and have lived there my whole life. I grew up hunting, fishing, and doing everything else you could want to do in nature. My whole family is like this, and I taught my boys to be the same. But I've never been one to believe all the silly stories people tell about Bigfoot and other silly animals that live in the woods and are said to exist. That is, until one day when my oldest son and I went fishing at a creek we like to go to often. In June of 1999, it was a beautiful sunny day, so we decided to make the most of it by packing some food and going fishing. Just a dad and a kid. So, we packed up everything, got the tackle box and fishing poles, and headed out. The creek we were going to is about 20 minutes from our house, which is a little bit outside of town. When we got to the creek, everything looked fine and busy. Even though it was June, the water in the stream was still very cold, which is great when you've been walking around in the hot sun. This spot is a typical creek bed, but there are a lot of tall bushes and brush all over the place. I'm talking about bushes that are 6 to 7 feet tall. It's not open and clear at all. So, to fish, you have to find a nice place along the riverbank. We found a good place to sit, and we started unpacking our food and setting up our tackle box and poles. As I sit there and help my son, I've noticed that he's not paying attention to what we're doing. Instead, he's looking over my shoulder with a very confused look on his face, as if he's not really paying attention. I thought that was strange, since fishing is my son's favorite hobby, and I never lose his attention for anything else. So I turned my head to see what he was looking at, and I think it might be a bear or something. But I was wrong. About 30 feet away, a face peeped out from behind a 5-foot bush and stared at both of us. It looked like a person, but it also had a Neanderthal look to it, with hair all over it and a head that was more like a cone. The cheeks were bare, and the skin looked like it was made of leather, but the whole face was covered in hair. I couldn't really see any pupils in the dark eyes. Its nose was like ours, not like a gorilla's. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. When it saw that both of us were looking at it, it quickly lowered its head. My son freaks out and asks what in the world that thing was doing looking at us. I was getting a little scared, too, but I just wanted to think that someone was playing a trick on us with a stupid Hollywood mask. I shouted, "Whoever you are, leave now, I have a gun on me," and this thing shot out from behind this bush and into the woods about 70 to 80 feet away faster than I could have ever imagined. Now, I want to remind you that it's the middle of the day, so we can see everything pretty well. It was about 5 to 6 feet tall and had a lot of hair. I mean, I'm talking full black hair. If a black bear could walk on 2 legs and run like a person, you'd be pretty close, except for the cone-shaped head and the lack of a neck. It looked like it didn't have much of a neck, and its arms moved back and forth. It also had a barrel-shaped body and was made like a tank. It ran without looking back, and I've never seen anything or anyone run so fast. When it got to the wood line, it went away. My son kept asking what on earth we had seen for the rest of the day. I told him we'd talk about it later and to just try to enjoy our fishing trip for now. We didn't fish there for very long, though, before he got too uncomfortable. So, we got in the car and drove back home. My son is out of it and asked me if we had seen a Bigfoot. I told him that Bigfoot doesn't exist and that someone must have been playing a joke on us. Looking back, I was very naive to think that I had seen an adult Bigfoot. When I told this story to some friends who are interested in Bigfoot, They told me that I probably saw a young Bigfoot because it seemed more curious and playful than it ever did territorial or aggressive. I'm not so scared anymore. No matter what it was strange. It was strange for me and my son to see what it was. Now that my son is an adult, he still goes fishing in the same spot where he did when he was younger. But we haven't talked much about it since, and I haven't brought it up again. Story 2. This is a story my grandfather told me about when he was a kid. His family has owned property in Texas for a long time, and he and his father used to hunt there. As of right now, our family had moved to Minnesota, and we've been living there for a long time. We don't even go to the old house anymore, and we haven't been there in a long time. My grandfather has been hunting since he was a boy, so he is pretty good at being in the woods and doesn't have much to be afraid of. Even now, when I hear about this event, it gives me chills because my grandfather still gets scared when he talks about it. My grandfather hunted all kinds of game, including deer, coyotes, squirrels, and so on. They had a lot of land to use. He had a lot of free time, so he could really get to know the woods around him and get a feel for the animals that lived there. There are even wild turkeys that run around there every now and then. So there was a lot to hunt all through the season. At the end of this particular day, he took a path he didn't usually take to go to a part of the property he wasn't used to. Both he and his father had several paths they could take. They would leave their property to go hunting in different places. After walking maybe a mile, he started to hear strange sounds and noises in the woods around him. At first, he thought it was a bird, but he told me that no birds in the woods make noises like these. The sounds would come and go. So at first he kind of ignored them, but then they got louder and more frequent. But my grandfather isn't afraid of anything, so he kept going. After maybe another mile, he started to smell a strong skunk musk smell that was said to smell like rotting meat and skunk. My grandfather said it was like finding a pile of 100 dead, rotting skunks baking in the sun. He said how strong it was. There were times when it was hard not to gag and throw up. He said that he kept looking around but didn't see anything. Instead, he started to feel like he was being watched very closely. He knew then that something was wrong. He couldn't find any sign of the smell, and as time went on, things got creepier. He also told me that as he explored the area, he sometimes came across things that didn't look quite right, like markings that didn't look like they were made by people, like they might have been made by animals or something. He told me that he had found smaller trees that had been dug up, turned upside down, and then put back into the ground. What's scary is that this happened in the 1940s, when their property was pretty big and private, so nobody would have been doing anything like this there. And if that's the case, who will pull all these small trees out of the ground and who will be strong enough to push them back in? This really freaked me out. My grandfather also thinks he found a small den of whatever he smelled. He said he found a small cave opening that led to a cave that he thought was about 30 square feet. But it smelled like a dead skunk, which was where it came from. He also said that he could see bones from the entrance of the cave, so he decided it was probably best to go home. Even though he thought they were deer bones, he didn't want to take any chances. He told me that as he was leaving the den, he felt an overwhelming sense of fear and had to get the hell out of there. Then he saw rocks the size of tires being thrown through the woods about 10 to 20 feet away from him. He was so scared because it was clear that this was enough. He ran away and got back home as quickly as he could. He said that whatever was throwing rocks at him had to be very strong and couldn't have been a person. He said that when he was leaving the den, he heard some kind of stomping and screaming sounds. Something was trying to get him to leave the area, and it wasn't far away. He told me that there were more than one of these things not even 50 feet away, but after that, he couldn't see them anymore. He still hunts on his land, but not nearly as much as he used to, and he has never gone further than where he used to. He kept moving to new places. His father never talked much about it, and I guess that's because there wasn't much to talk about back then, and it would have been almost crazy to bring it up. When his father died, the house went to him, and not long after that, he moved to Minnesota for his job, which is the third story. My fiancé and I love to camp and do things outside all the time. We usually like to hike and explore a lot. We've been on a lot of different trails, hikes, and had a lot of fun out in the woods. I am a firm believer in the paranormal, Bigfoot, and other strange things that do happen, but I have never seen anything strange or even at a place. I've heard of them, but I've never really been one until this event I'm about to tell you about. We decided to camp at Lake Dui in Michigan, which is one of our favorite lakes. We've camped here a few times before, and every time was great. So we thought that this time wouldn't be any different. It was later in September, and I remember that it was still pretty warm, but the cold, crisp air of fall hadn't come yet. We had a typical day of fun at the lake. We hung out, went hiking, and hung out in our tent before going back out for more hiking. After dinner, we came back to relax for the night. But by the end of the first night, my boyfriend was acting weird. He was getting very quiet and not talking as much as he usually does. I thought it was because he was tired because we had been out all day. We put out the fire in the end and went to bed for the night. I could tell he was nervous and had trouble falling asleep, but he didn't say anything. Even when I asked if he was all right. I went to bed right away and woke up the next day. No problem getting a good night's sleep and feeling ready for the next day. Him, not so much. He didn't look so good and seemed like he was still on edge from yesterday. After getting up, eating breakfast, and going on the next hike, the day seemed pretty normal, and we decided to get ready to go back to camp, because it was getting later in the afternoon. When I asked him what was wrong, he just said he didn't like where we were and felt like we were being closely watched. I told him he was just crazy and that it was silly to think that nothing was out there and that nothing was going to hurt us. I persuaded him to spend another night with me, but he seemed nervous about it. Now, his strange behavior was bothering me because it wasn't like him. He's usually one of the first people to think of crazy hiking trails and places for us to check out. He was always the first one of us to want to go to dangerous places and look at things that weren't meant to be looked at. This night was a bit quieter, and I think we both went to bed a bit earlier than usual. My boyfriend just laid there trying to sleep while I stayed up and thought about running on my cell phone. It had been a pretty quiet evening. Since we got back to camp, we hadn't really talked much. After he sat me down and told me what he did earlier, it was kind of boring. I had been a little on edge, but I just tried to ignore it. If I remember correctly, it was pretty late at night. I think my phone said something like 11:32, and this is when we started to hear heavy footsteps in our campsite, and then breathing. I started to feel very uneasy, and every time someone walked, I could hear a thud. I started to get scared because I didn't know if what we were facing was a bear or someone who wanted to hurt us. I turned to my boyfriend and asked, "Did you hear what I heard?" He was as white as a ghost and just nodded at me. I sat there, scared, looking at the door of my tent and trying to listen for any sound I could. After a while, I could only hear the sound of the night air. Every few seconds, the stomping would stop, and then it would start again. Whatever it was walking around our tent in circles, but it wasn't getting into our stuff like a bear would. It seemed like it was checking out our tent or something. Whatever it was kept coming closer and closer to the tent, and we could hear it breathing heavily. It sounded like a 10-foot tall man, so it must have been big. Either that, or for the next few hours, it was a bison on two legs walking around our campsite. This would go on and off until about 3 or 4 a.m., when we could finally go to sleep. We didn't even notice when the noise stopped and the fear went away. I think my boyfriend and I fell asleep because we were too tired and scared to stay awake. We still don't talk about it, and when we woke up the next day, neither of us said a word. We just got out of there as fast as we could and packed up. From what we saw and heard, it must have been a Bigfoot. It's possible that someone was going through our camp. I have no idea what it was. I don't think I'll ever return to that lake again. Travis and I have been hunting together for as long as I can remember, back when my paw, God rest, was still alive. When we were little, his soul would take us away. He always told us how impressed he was with how quickly we were able to figure out our surroundings and notice things like tracks, markings, and sounds. It went well. We didn't start going hunting with him until we were about 9 or 10, when we were a little older. We loved it right away. When we were about 17 and 16, respectively, our paw died of cancer. Since my younger brother is only a year or a year and a half younger than I am, things haven't been the same. So, my brother and I try to hunt together every year as a way to remember that and keep the tradition going. It's important for the family line. Our uncle has some land that has been in the family for a long time. My brother, Paul, and I have been hunting there for a long time over the past 5 years. Specifically, we had been hunting in other places, and it just wasn't the same as hunting on our uncle's land. So we decided to try it again this year by going back to our uncle's. We talked to him and got the all clear. We got there early in the morning, and luckily there were several tree stands set up all over my uncle's property. He has more than 80 acres of deep woods. We are in Montana, after all, and there is a really nice cabin-style house where we sometimes stay before going camping. This time, we knew we wanted to go to our usual tree stands, so we got there early in the morning and got ready to go. It was clear that my brother would take a stand about half a mile from where I was. We were both going to walk about 2 to 3 miles into the woods to get to a certain spot that we both knew about. It was a pretty good clearing, and there were usually a lot of bucks and does here. So we knew we were in the best place. We got up and left for the places that had been told to us. We had to leave. My brother and I both wished each other luck. Once I got there, I climbed up into my tree stand, sat down, and waited. When I get to my tree stand, it's hard for me not to want to just chill out and be comfortable. It's great. I feel like I belong when I'm out in nature and hunting. And I have always been so calm. The light was just barely getting in. It couldn't have been later than 5 or 6 in the morning. I don't really remember. I thought it was strange, though, that I didn't see much wildlife in the area as we walked back to these stands. At the time, I didn't think much of it because an hour had passed and nothing had happened. The woods were very quiet, and all the animals had left. That is, there was no sign of anything. I found it so strange. It was a long time after that before I heard strange sounds coming from the woods. I couldn't really figure out where it was coming from around me. I just knew it was coming from close by and would circle me. I thought at first that a big buck was finally passing through the area because the sound was so loud. I kept hearing branches breaking and brush being crushed. The only problem is that the heavy thumps and steps I heard didn't sound like they were coming from an animal with 4 legs. It sounded like a heavy person, but it didn't sound like a person at all. I started to hear what I can only describe as whooping sounds and other strange noises. I began to feel nervous. As the sounds got louder, I looked out of my tree stand to see if I could see what was making them. I saw this big, hairy man walking into the woods from the clearing not even 50 yards away from me. I quickly ducked my head down to make sure it didn't see me, and I could hear it wheezing and breathing hard with every step it took. I heard it walking toward me, and as it got closer to where I was standing, it slowed down. I was scared to death and didn't know what to do. I held on tight to my rifle and hoped I wouldn't have to use it in this fight because I knew I wouldn't be able to beat this thing on my own. It moved slowly around me and kept going. I waited until it was completely gone before I moved a muscle. It felt like an eternity. I quickly opened the hatch, got out of my stand, and ran to my brother's stand, which I knew was only half a mile away. I didn't think it would be too far. And I should be fine if I can get past the thing that walked right under my stand. The woods were still quiet, which made me very nervous because it meant that it was still in the area. I probably only took 10 minutes or less to get to my brother's stand. He also looked like a ghost. I told him what had happened, but he didn't have much to say. He just told us to leave, so we ran out of there as fast as we could. I've been hunting for a long time, but I'd never seen or met anything like what happened that morning. My brother didn't tell me about it until we got back to the truck. He saw the same thing walking near History Stand, but he doesn't think it saw him or meant any harm. He might be right. But it's something I don't ever want to happen again. It really scared me to death, and I haven't been able to hunt on my uncle's land since my brother got over it and moved on, but he won't talk about it. Since then, we've found other hunting areas and spots. Even if it's an unspoken rule, I think we've all decided not to go back. Also, whoever is messing around with my uncle's property should stay far away from me. 5 story. When I was in my early 20s, I loved to go out and explore as much as I could in the winter. My favorite time to go hiking was in the fall. Everything was so magical, and even though it was cold, the weather never scared me away. I always dressed for the weather, even though most people didn't go outside at that time. My favorite thing would be to drive down all the band and logging roads and just stop and start exploring. Most of the woods around there haven't been touched, so those are usually the best parts. Of course, I like to go out and see the world in almost every season. Yes, but winter is so different. I don't hunt or work in the woods for a living. I just like to go hiking and look around. But I have a lot of good friends who love being outside and hunting. Now, no matter what season it is, there is always something to see and do. I often bring things like elephant knives and other weapons with me in case I run into a bear, a mountain lion, or anything else that could put me in danger at this time. As I was looking around, I found what looked like very large tracks down by a small frozen river a few miles into the woods. I've always been pretty open-minded about Bigfoot, but it was amazing to see this for myself. I'm not sure if anyone else comes out this way, but if they do, I doubt they'll leave a fake footprint on the ground. This was an old creek bed that had dried up and looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The footprints looked like they had been there for a long time and been frozen. I think what really got to me was how the footprint looked as a whole. I could tell that it was pretty deep into the frozen ground. Now, these footprints weren't really in the snow. Even more so in a place where the snow is melting but the ground is still completely frozen, and the footprints look like they were there before the snow. This or these footprints show that whatever left them must have been very heavy. The footprints were at least 16 inches long and had only faded a little bit, so they were pretty well kept. I think that was because they were put in a cold fridge. It was interesting to see that the footprint had 5 clearly defined toes but no real arch. It was clear that it was made by a 2-legged animal. I looked at the footprints, which were scattered along the riverbank and led into the woods. Even more crazy is the stride. The distance between the tracks was about 5 to 6 feet. What in the world would walk that way out here? I didn't even want to try to figure out what it might be. I thought about following the footprints, but that seemed like a bad idea right away because I didn't know what animal made them, and they were going in the opposite direction of where I wanted to go. I like to explore, but I'm not stupid enough to put myself in a potentially dangerous situation when I don't know what I'm dealing with. I don't make molds of tracks, so I don't have any casting materials with me, nor do I ever carry them. It just so happens that I ran into these tracks. After a while, I went back to my car and drove back home. I couldn't get it out of my mind. There are a few close friends of mine who are big fans of Bigfoot. So I told them about it, and they were thrilled that I had told them. Not only did they say I found Bigfoot footprints, but they also told me about scary things that happened to them in those same woods. I don't know if Bigfoots really exist or not at this point, but I do know that those footprints are hard to explain and I don't know what animal made them. We're glad you watched this video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe to What Looks Beneath, leave a comment, and hit the like button. All of these things help my channel grow. Also, keep an eye out for whatlooksbeneath.com, which is coming soon. On that site, you'll be able to send me your own scary story and have it read on this channel, where thousands of people will hear it. Soon, we'll be putting out new products and a podcast series that comes out every week. There are a lot of great things coming. Fans, stay tuned. I didn't have this happen to me, but it did to a family that is always very against the supernatural or paranormal. They never believe anything, and even now they are still trying to figure out what happened. They live in a big old house in a rural area. One night, they heard someone knocking on the door, but they didn't open it. Instead, they went to the door and looked out the top window, but they didn't see anyone. More people are knocking on their front door, back door, and side door. It was about 3 in the morning. So they thought someone was going to break in, which makes sense since someone had knocked on their door earlier in the day and no one answered. They got their guns and stood by in case someone walked in instead of breaking down the door. This time, there were more knocks. Also written on the walls was that the husband finally got up the courage to look outside, but what he saw made no sense. Wolves, not coyotes, were following the old house around. This happened also in the southern plains, where there are no wolves. Maybe there are coyotes, cougars, or even 1 or 2 bears. But wolves, as I said, this husband and wife still don't know exactly how wolves were able to knock on their doors and walls, but they are sure it wasn't something supernatural. I can't remember if that happened to me or not. I would be a little bit suspicious. My mom is from a small town in Mexico, and the people there tell the craziest stories about elves, witches, and all kinds of other creatures that play at night and turn into balls of fire and bounce around. But I was always a bit doubtful. My husband took me to a place in Hidalgo, Mexico, one night. It's kind of like a remote area with a big hole in the ground, and it's only about 20 minutes from where my mom lives. Around 10 or 11 p.m., nobody was around, as expected. It was just me and my husband, and I could see that balls of fire bounced from different sides of the crater as if they were playing. There is a small town at the bottom of the crater, but it doesn't have electricity, so it wasn't lights or anything like that. I honestly didn't expect to see anything, and I don't know if the witches saw us or not, but they weren't trying to hide what they were doing. These fireballs can show up anywhere. Not just this crater, because I've heard a lot of similar stories from people in Mexico, including my dad, who is from a different town. However, it's more common to see them in places where they can bounce around, like hills, mountains, or craters. I also saw a ferry, which was in the United States. But that's a different tale. Back in. I did it in the summer of 1991 or 1992, when I was with a different group of kids. We lived and played on this street with 3 of the other kids, whose backyards were right next to ours. All of the houses were pretty old, and there was an empty lot next to a creepy old house where nothing ever happened. It was really scary. On the west side of the houses, the woods ran along and down to the Trinity River. Carswell Air Force Base used to be on the other side of the river. When we went there by accident, 3 soldiers in full camouflage with their guns pointed at my chest. But that's something else. We played in those woods, swam in that river, and got into trouble in those woods in general. We were told to stay away from those woods because there were always rumors that a satanic cult lived there. But being young teens, we didn't listen. One day, we ran around and looked around in the woods. We might have used a BB gun and pellets to hunt squirrels. I didn't know until everyone got a strange feeling. There was something wrong. We decided to quit early, so we climbed out of the woods and went back up to the road. We went to an empty lot and looked at the woods on the other side of the river and at the base of the hill. We heard it at that time. This horrible scream that sounded like it came from a monster movie. It was loud and sounded half like a monster and half like a person. God, it was so loud. It scared me to death, and it still scares me to death 28 years later. I have no idea what we heard, but we all heard it. It was the first time I'd ever used a swear word. Years ago, the spillway from Lake Worth fed some water into that branch of the Trinity River. There were silly stories about the goat man out there. But people still told stories about it. Since it was a military base, it wouldn't surprise me if strange experiments were done and a creature got out and ran away. I wish I could connect something to my head so that I could make that sound. I think it could have been a Bigfoot, though, because when I looked up sounds on YouTube years later, the one that came closest to what I heard was a Bigfoot call. If you search for Bigfoot sounds on YouTube. In 2004, I was on my family's land in Fairview, Tennessee. The land was a couple of acres, and I was walking around picking up trash to keep the land clean. Out of nowhere, it's a very cloudy day in the fall, probably late September or early October. I can hear this total cacophony of sounds coming from the back of our property, where the trees are. I turned my head to see if some of our neighbors' cattle were coming through a hole in the fence or something. Instead, I still see a very large bird. The image of this bird is burned into my brain. It looked like a golden eagle and had to be about 10 feet tall from head to toe and about 20 feet wide at the wings. I went through puberty early and was already 6 feet tall when I did. At this point, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I could have written on this bird. It went through the forest and tried to sit on a group of trees it had grabbed with its talons, but the trees were all pretty small, and it was much bigger than them. When 2 of the trees broke, the bird flapped its wings quickly and flew away. It flew straight up in a way I'd never seen a bird do before, and it rose above the clouds almost instantly. I waited another hour, hoping to see it again. My family didn't believe me, though. The thing I remember most about those days is that we found a lot of dead deer and cows in the area that were almost completely picked clean in the weeks before I saw him. Most of them have broken ribs and large wounds on their backs and sides. I've only been able to think about how big of a bird hunting trip it must have been. My family still doesn't believe me, and no one else in the area did either, except for a trucker who said he saw the same thing flying at night near Brentwood, Tennessee, in the summer. I like to think of that bird as the king of the sky, the most powerful form of life in the air after dark. My dog loves to sit at the window and watch to see if anything is moving outside. She'll growl whenever she sees something, and I'll always look at her to see if she's growling at moving plants or at something real. On this particular night, I saw something come out of a bush on the other side of the street. It stopped in the middle of the street, and I called my mom over so she could see it too before it moved on. From where we were standing, it looked to be about 1.5 feet tall. It was neither wide nor long, but it looked thick. It might sound silly, but I'd say it looks like the outline of a gnome. It could have been a child, but because it looked so big, the child would have had to be wearing a heavy jacket. But this happened in August when it was 80 degrees. My brother said it was a black fox that lives around here, which is a good guess, but the way it walked had a bounce to it that only a two-legged animal could do. Imagine a child running around with swords in their hands, eager to get where they were going. That's how it was. My dad has told me many stories about things he saw in Mexico when he was a child. One night, he woke up around 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning because he had to go to the bathroom. At the time, his house didn't have a bathroom. So, we went outside. Because he was scared, he woke up one of his older brothers and asked him to go outside with him. So they went outside. My dad hid behind a bush, and his brother was nearby to keep him company and tell him to hurry up because he wanted to go back to sleep. Then, in the distance, my dad sees a small figure. He said it looked like a dollar or something, but it had red eyes that were glowing and grew bigger as it got closer. My dad was scared, so he called his brother and told him to meet him by the bush. My dad told his brother what he saw in a quiet voice. So they both look at the boring creature. Suddenly, it runs off to the side into some other bushes, but really, really fast. Both my dad and his brother looked at each other and ran back into the house. When I was a kid, my mom took me to see my grandparents a lot. The house was in France, at the edge of the village, next to a forest and a few empty grassy fields. When I was about 8 years old, I used to ride my little bike around the house. But I never knew why, but I always felt strange when I was behind the house on the far side. Strangely, one day I was riding my bike around the house as usual, and as I passed my mother's car, I saw a small man inside the car watching me. Strange was that I remembered seeing him first but not paying much attention to him, as if it were normal. I still remember what he looked like. After almost 30 years. He was probably about 50 centimeters tall and had a funny-looking mustache. So I didn't pay attention and went around the house again. When I saw him looking at me again, I freaked out and ran inside to tell my mom and grandma what I had seen. After I pushed them a little, they came down to check, but there was no one there. I went there a few years ago, after my grandparents had been gone for a long time. So the house is empty, but that forest feels even more dangerous than when I was a child. When I was maybe 7 years old, I went to a place where a lot of strange things were said to happen. I won't tell you much about my Aunt Shelley, but we're from the Northeast and way up north. Shelley, my aunt, was crazy about fairies. She had dolls, about which I can tell you more another time. But paintings, murals, rugs, coffee mugs, fairies, and black grapes all moved around without her touching them. Anyway, I was in her fairy garden, and saw a tiny table and 4 chairs that looked like they were made of cast iron and had a glass top. I'm very interested in it. So I lean in and move a black grapevine out of the way. So she grew a lot of them, And now there are 5 tiny fairies hiding behind it. They are sickly thin, white, and have hair like the stuff that grows under corn husks. They don't have any faces. I saw them all sit down and grotesquely eat the 5th fairy. I don't know what went on after that. I think my mom picked me up and took me home to eat dinner. I can't think of it. I was so focused on the tiny bones, the ribs sticking out of the chest, and the sticky black blood that it was hard for me to see anything else. About 14 to 15 years have passed. I was camping in an area where Bigfoot has been seen a lot. We had lived in the mountains for many years when my mom called my name and said, "I hear Bigfoot." I was almost asleep. We had a small ranch where we kept horses, chickens, pigs, and other animals. I've been hunting for as long as I can remember and have spent most of my life in the mountains. This is unlike anything I've ever heard. It was louder than a bugle from an elk. Over an hour, all the dogs in the area were going crazy. We listened to it, and sometimes it sounded like it was getting really close, but then it would go away. It was moving all over the place, which was really weird. So, I live in Oregon, where woods are pretty much everywhere. When I went camping with a friend, we went hiking. While we were hiking, we heard a loud, horrifying scream coming from the area near the creek. This pretty much scared us both to death, and we ran for like a mile in 5 minutes. Also, it didn't sound like an elk, a goat, or any other animal. It was almost like a really strange sound. I'm not sure how to explain it. Also, the campground was called Trout Creek, and it was near Sweet Home, Oregon. By the way, it's a beautiful place that you should go see. This year, I'm going back. If I see anything strange, I'll make sure to write it down, and I'll hike the same trail I did last year. Also, when I was younger, I would make a game out of trying to calm my mind and not make any noise as I walked through the forest. This helped me figure out what I might have heard. I was hiking and about 6 miles from the closest road. I was walking along an old game trail in the Rocky Mountains when I heard a stream up ahead. When I got there, I started walking along the stream, hoping to find a good spot with fish. A few minutes later, I came around a big old tree at a bend and saw a small figure about the size of a child sitting on a rock with its back to me. It was wearing strange greenish clothes. I was surprised by this, and as soon as I saw it, it turned around and looked at me. I raised my hand and I said hi. While I was doing that, I got a spiritual message from it. It was mostly shocked and surprised that I had come so close without it noticing. I also got the feeling that it lived nearby and liked to hang out by the stream. I heard a rustling in the bushes to my right, turned around and looked back, but it was gone. The second one. My parents bought a house in the same general area where the above story happened. 20 years later, when I went to visit, I slept downstairs, where I don't think anyone had ever slept before because the house was only a few years old. Before I went to sleep, I set up the wards around the room. At 1 a.m., I woke up when I saw a green ball of light come through the south wall and stop about 3 feet above the floor. Got the same kind of instant communication with the spirit world. It lived underground and used that route to get to where it was going. It had been using the same route for a long time. It didn't think it would meet anything less than a person, so it stopped in shock when it saw me there. I've seen strange paranormal and supernatural things since I was a very young child, so I've never tried to ignore them because I've always thought there's a lot we don't know about. When I was in my 20s, I dated a guy who liked camping just as much as I did. He chose to take me to Kentucky to see some friends who lived on 150 acres near the Daniel Boone Forest. After a long drive, We got to our destination and met our hosts, who were a really nice couple. They lived in a log cabin that the guy had built. There was no electricity, and the water came from a creek on the property. The water was so clean that you could drink it straight. We were walking around the property and looking at the beautiful gardens that our house hostess had been growing for about 20 years. The property was amazing. At the top of the crust, there was a cave, and the forest was full of hieroglyphs. The size of the flowers, fruit trees, and vegetables was huge. It was all lush and beautiful. Their house was in an area that had been cleared out and was surrounded by woods and a creek. As our hostess showed us the gardens, we were standing at the tree line, and out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing a huge bug. I don't have a fear of bees, but this was huge. So I finally turned to look, and what I saw shocked me. A tiny man was hovering over my shoulder. He had very fast beating wings that made the same sound as a hummingbird's wings. He had black hair, ears that were pointed, and green clothes that almost looked like leaves. I looked at him for what felt like minutes but was probably only a few seconds, not really knowing what I was seeing. He put his hands up by his ears and blew a raspberry at me. He smiled mischievously and took off like a rocket. I turned back to our hostess, and she must have been very surprised to see my face. She gave him a sweet smile and asked, "Did you see a fairy?" She went on to say that they were all over the land. Then, at night, we sat on the front porch and watched little lights in the grass rise and fall. My boyfriend and I slept outside in our tent, and the next morning I got up early and walked around the dewy yard. At least 3 beautiful fairy rings were made in the grass. I've been to a lot of magical and beautiful places, but that one is the best one I've ever seen. I don't know what to call it, but it looked like a big black dog or wolf. It wasn't a coyote, nor was it a normal animal with mange, or anything else like that, according to her dog. About half the size of a car, it was. When I was a child living with my parents, I saw this animal. About a quarter of a mile of woods were behind us. In the bathroom, there used to be a small, frosted window that was partly underground. This meant that the window was just at ground level, if that makes sense. It was already very late. I can't sleep, so I wake up 4 to 5 times a night. Anyway, I looked out the window and saw something glowing yellow and then moving. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or something, but it scared me. When I got back to my room, the cat was on the windowsill growling and hissing. I thought it was another cat outside at the time. I was scared, but I went to the window corner and carefully pulled the curtain back. Just a little bit. What I saw gave me the chills. It looked like a very large dog or wolf. It had a big hump on its back and a long, greasy tail. As it moved around the yard, the motion sensor light kept going off, but it was too far away to see it clearly. It looked like it was eating apples that had fallen from our tree. But the thing that scared me the most was that it walked on its 2 back legs. I felt like my blood was turning to ice, and I couldn't move at all out of fear. I couldn't look away. I just kept looking at it until it went back into the woods. This happened when my sister and I were kids. She was probably 4 or 5 years old at the time, and I was about 6 years old. One late afternoon, we were at her grandparents' house in the city, where their backyard is full of trees and slopes down to a river. Just the 2 of us were playing house in the back. When I went back to my sister, she told me that she had just talked to 2 small people with wings, but that they had already flown away. I asked her what they looked like and where these small people lived before they flew. She just told me that 3 to 5 of them landed near the stove, but she wasn't scared. She told me that they were good previews of this year. I remember asking her about it again to make sure it really happened and that she wasn't making stuff up. She said she saw them with her own eyes and wouldn't lie about it. I don't really feel bad that I couldn't meet them myself. I live out in the country. My house is right in the middle of the forest. People know that the woods have ghosts. Anyway, I was letting my dogs out in the woods behind my house one night. Down the street, there are a few houses, but no one goes into each other's yards, and there are no kids here. It sounded like someone was running toward us when my dogs started barking at the woods. I asked my husband to get a flashlight because lost hikers often come through our yard because they can see our lights. There were no people there. After about an hour. It's about 11 p.m., and I'm sitting in the living room. Because it was so hot that night, I had my porch light on and my door open. When my dog started barking, I went outside, and this little kid on a bike came out of nowhere. To be honest, I was very worried. This kid didn't look to be more than 10 years old. I told him to stop by screaming. I was worried that he might get lost. It's a national park, so there are campsites in the woods, but it's miles away from where I live. I was afraid he would get lost on his own. He didn't stop. He ended up riding around the block and down the hill, and then he just looked at me. He was wearing a grey hoodie, and had dark eyes. I felt scared, ran back inside, and locked the doors. I felt sick. I think it was a black-eyed child because I talked to another neighbor, who has seen something even scarier than I have. I don't leave my door open no more at night. My neighbors and my husband are the only ones who believe me. First of all, I'm a pagan, which is basically a religion based on the earth, and I worship it. When I first started learning about paganism, or Wicca as it was called at the time, I met a group of people who met every Saturday night. In fact, it was a lot of fun. We would joke around and talk about our different lives. When they started talking about how some of them had heard or seen dragons, I stopped listening. I went along with them, but I think they are just making things up. One guy said he lived out in the country and would hear dragons roaring from the woods. I think it was more likely a bobcat or an angry redneck who lost his beer for some reason. I looked up at the sky, but I couldn't see any clouds. The sun was still shining in the vast blue space. I saw something in the sky that looked like a big snake moving in a strange way. Being a huge believer in UFOs, I told everyone about this. It writhed and moved around like a snake in the sky. I just couldn't take my eyes off of it. Before everyone had a phone with a camera, this is all I have to remember it by. Once I told them, they all looked up and agreed that it was a dragon. They know now that we are talking about them. I'm not saying it was a dragon, but it was a UFO in the way that the word is used. Since then, I haven't seen anything like it, and in all the years I've been a pagan, I've never seen a real dragon. So, about 12 years ago, this happened. My family has a farm that is right in the middle of an Indian reservation. One winter, I was home for Christmas and taking care of the farm while my parents went Christmas shopping. I was home alone very late at night when I heard all of our cows freaking out. I knew it must have been one of the many wild dogs in the area. So I put on some boots, grabbed a shotgun, loaded it up, and headed out to the field. It was cloudy, but the full moon was shining through the clouds, just enough to light up the snow. This was the perfect setting for a scary movie. I ran out into the middle of the field and just in time I saw two dogs fighting. They were standing up and facing each other. So I put a shell in my Mr. 12 gauge and then something happened. The two dogs stopped when they heard the rack, looked at me, and then ran away on their back legs. I stopped right away, and all the native ghost stories and stories about skinwalkers that I had heard as a child ran through my mind. Keep in mind that I'm just a white guy and that these were just scary stories until then. The native kids like to scare us with stories about the night when the animals came to life. My uncle and cousins saw a big deer by the roadside. As they got closer, he jumped over the fence like a man who walks on two legs. When my dad was coming back from Gallup, he saw an old Navajo woman walking along the side of the road. When he slowed down to offer her a ride, she ran off into the plains as fast as a person could. When I was a kid, my family and I were at my aunt's house, which is in a rural, secluded area. A few different entities played tricks on us by making animal noises and turning on and off a flashlight when we looked in the direction of the noises. The sounds would come from every direction and get closer together. Most of the time, when I go to the reservation late at night by myself, I feel evil and fear. Panic and fear will come over me, but as soon as they do, they go away. My grandmother on my mother's side has always, for lack of a better word, been very superstitious. She isn't religious, but she believes in a lot of weird things. Her mother was 100% Navajo, and her father was 100% Irish. She had never been east of Montana, and she was born and raised in Nevada. When I was in elementary school, we went to see her one year. Most of the time, it was pretty boring, like most visits with old people. However, she always kept her curtains closed and peeked out the window. When asked what she was doing, she would just say blue. She has her eyes on me. This went on almost the whole time we were there, until a few days before my grandmother and 19-year-old brother were to leave. We were planting flowers in the front yard that night when she yelled at my little brother to get away from the creature, because it wasn't safe. We all thought, since he was in Nevada, that he had found a scorpion or a rattlesnake. So we all ran outside and saw my grandmother holding my little brother and shaking in fear against the side of the house. A big black dog about the size of a Great Dane was standing in the yard. It was looking at my grandmother with an intensity I had never seen before. It looked up at us, huffed a little, and ran away. I don't remember if it moved fast or not, but I do remember that it had really deep yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what happened, she kept saying in a blue voice, "She has found me." She moved a few weeks later, so I took a nap this afternoon, which is nothing new. In my dream, I was in a very strange rural place, and I was walking around the corner of my garden, between the house and the fence, toward the front of my house. As I'm walking, a huge animal comes up behind me. It looked so strange and big that I froze and hoped it would go away. Its face looked like that of an anteater. It had a wide head that narrowed into a short, thin snout. It also had large, dark, slanted eyes that were very far apart. You could see the skull's curve and the details of the nose bone, like the bridge. I guess it was too flat and not dark brown enough. It had a body like a deer or an antelope, but the curve of its rib cage was more pronounced, like a greyhound. The legs were very long, and the feet looked like split hoofs. There was no tail on it. I was scared because I didn't know what the hell it was. And I remember that in the dream, I was trying to figure out what it was as it walked by me in a narrow space. It said hello, and as I stared at it, I felt scared. Suddenly, it leaned back and stood up on its back legs. When I blinked, it was no longer a strange dog that ate antelope, but a woman. She was a white woman with brown hair and brown eyes. She was very tall. She had to be at least 10 feet tall. She told me she was glad I didn't run away from her because most people are scared of her and do run away, especially when she talks. I stood there dumbfounded and told her I was scared of her because I had never seen anything like her before. But now she was different, and I was at ease. She told me that because she is so tall, most people are scared of her. Anyway, she had some kind of injury, and I can't remember what it was or how I fixed it, but I do remember fixing it. I don't know how we ended up meeting the girl outside, but we did. She wasn't some weird creature, just a normal girl who was very tall, like 6 feet, and I could tell the other girl liked her, so I decided to leave them alone. I was being followed by a tall creature girl, and I didn't realize why until I looked up and saw a hole in the wall and she was looking back at me. She seemed very angry and upset, and I wanted to know why I left her like that. Anyway, to make a long story short, I had a weird, scary sex dream in which I was having sex in the woods with that creature girl when she was human, and a few other girls. There was also a lot of witchcraft and weird symbols in the air, like consciously wishing for things while having sex. It seemed like the more I had sex with these girls, the more control I had over the world of my dreams, and I could make people do things just by thinking about it during sex. A man who had hurt me a lot in the past also showed up. In the dark, he stood at the top of the path and watched me have sex. The dream was very scary because I didn't know what was going on or why I was having sex with so many girls. Even when we were making love, I was scared of the creature girl. I only woke up from this stupidly long nap because my dog got on the bed with me and sat next to my face, whining and pawing. Needless to say, it woke me up, and now it's 4 AM and I don't want to sleep because I'm worried about what I might dream about. I've always had weird, scary dreams, especially when my PTSD is bad, but I've never had a dream like that before, and the idea of a creepy creature turning into a girl and then trying to seduce me really scared me. It's like my mind went off and took acid while I was sleeping last night. As well as an FYI, I'm a bisexual guy's girlfriend. I'm 24, and I live in the UK. I'm a basic Irish person, nothing too interesting about that. I'm a pagan. But my family is Catholic and I was raised Catholic, so having sex with girls isn't weird to me. It's just that this particular incident felt so real. I got pleasure from the dream both in my body and in my head, so I decided to make a scary animal hybrid. I'm not quite sure. Is it possible that a skinwalker or a Wendigo seduced me and used my dreams to get into my life or maybe attach itself to me? How do you feel? I was a teacher in Gallup, New Mexico, for more than 10 years. Most of my Navajo students talked to me about skinwalkers. My own life isn't all that interesting. My roommate and I both heard a strange gurgling sound coming from outside our house. We asked the men who live next door to look into it, but they didn't find anything. We went to a canyon with ghosts. It was closed the weekend before because there were skinwalkers in the area, which was scary. Some of my students said that skinwalkers who howled and scratched at their doors ruined different ceremonies. They also said I could go to a certain lake at night and watch the skinwalkers come to drink. I'm glad. I never saw one of these things in New Mexico, but I'm very, very curious about them, even though I want to stay as far away from them as possible. One of my daughters will turn 21 in December, and she wants to go to Colorado with the rest of the family as a gift. Some of you have read about my experiences and know that I haven't left the East Coast since I came back to get away from the skinwalker who was bothering me. I have no plans to ever go back to Arizona again. You couldn't pay me $7 million to go back. But since Colorado is close to Arizona, and I never did anything to break whatever connection it had to me, I can't help but wonder if it's still waiting for me. It has been decades since I last saw them. So, I know that it probably isn't out there and that Colorado is a big place, but I'm still a little worried. My daughter doesn't want me to go if I'm scared, but she really wants to go to Colorado, and I wouldn't want to let her down on her 21st birthday. Is there a way for the natives to keep the skinwalkers away? I hope this doesn't hurt anyone's feelings, and I'm not making fun of anyone's culture. I have a lot of respect for native people and just want to relax before my trip. I'm sure there are skinwalkers, and if there's anything the natives did to keep them away, I'll do it as respectfully as I can. I'm not the type of person to think that every shadow, strange sound, or bump in the night is a monster, and I wouldn't say it was a skinwalker unless I really thought it was one. I just started looking into skinwalkers because I like horror movies a lot and body horror scares me the most. When I read stories, I see scary similarities to things I saw as a child. I was in the woods near my house with my dog. Every time I went into the woods, I went farther, and this time I went the farthest I had ever gone. I found a brick building that was kind of falling apart. It was only about the size of a shed and had only 3 walls that were only about 4 feet tall. There was a pile of deer skins outside the building, and deer bones inside. I could be wrong because it was a long time ago, but I remember there being no meat. I went home and decided I wouldn't go back into the woods alone with my dog. Years later, some kids from the neighborhood asked me to go into the woods with them because one of them had seen something strange. So I went with them, and we got pretty far into the woods before we saw this thing crawling up a hill. I should say that the woods here are in the shape of a V, with a creek running through the middle. On one side of the V, we were, and it was on the other. It could have been either a very short-haired white dog like a greyhound or a dog with no fur at all. It was very pale and skinny, and the places where a dog's joints should be were not right. It has normal-looking back legs, but its front legs are bent like a person dragging themselves. It was already having trouble getting up the hill, and it looks like the dead leaves on the ground kept making it slide down. Even though it was daytime, we were all scared to death and decided to run back home. This happened when I was in middle school, and since then, nothing else has happened. I hadn't been back to the woods since either. Now, keep in mind that the woods are not in the middle of nowhere. No matter which way we went, we were never more than a 3-minute sprint from a neighborhood. So it could have been a dog that got away, and my fear made me think it was worse than it was. But because of that, I'd like to know what you think about what happened. So, a long time ago, a close friend and I were bored and decided to explore the woods nearby. We lived in the middle of a thick forest that went on for miles around us. It was a boring place to live, to be honest. We didn't know anyone our age, and there was no internet. So, while we were sitting around with nothing to do, we decided to pack up some things and go for a walk in the woods. My friend is a big guy, mostly because he's crazy about bodybuilding, so it was hard to scare him. But as we walked in, we both felt like someone was watching us. The atmosphere was tense and odd. There were no sounds in the woods, no birds chirping, no wind, and not even the sound of a cricket. We scared ourselves for about 20 minutes before we heard a bark and saw where I live. We have stray dogs on the streets and in the woods. The ones in the woods are not as friendly as the ones on the streets because they are usually very hungry. We stopped what we were doing and listened carefully to find out where the sound was coming from. It sounded close and came from our left. But as the barking went on, we both realized that something didn't sound right. I don't know how to say it, but it was almost like someone was trying to act like a dog and doing a very good job of it, but it wasn't quite the same. Then we noticed something else that was strange about our dog friend. The bark was like it was being played over and over on a speaker. My friend said that something doesn't seem right and that he's really scared, and I won't lie, I was shaking. You could say that being scared in the middle of the night in the woods in the middle of nowhere is pretty normal. But this was not the same. Every part of us wanted to say, "Get out of here." But we were too scared to move. I finally told my friend to run, but he didn't want to do it. We ran like our lives depended on it, but we could still feel that thing coming after us. When we found our way back, we were out of breath, and my friend said that he heard branches breaking as we were pulling ourselves out of there, and he was about to cry hysterically out of pure fear. The strangest thing, though, is that we both live in a country that has nothing to do with America or Native American culture. What do you think was following us back there? Do you have similar things happen to you? I live in northern Utah, not in Navajo Nation, but I'm only about 3 hours from the adamantium Skinwalker Ranch, which shows how close I am to Skinwalker territory. I live in a neighborhood, so I'm not at all alone, but my neighborhood is at the top of a mountain, and there's nothing but mountains around it. So basically, it's just a neighborhood cut into the side of a mountain. There aren't even any trees in the houses or yards. I'm not afraid of forests or mountains, and I don't mind being by myself. People and sometimes cougars are the only things that make me nervous. I'm a young girl, and I've spent a lot of nights in the mountains with just my dad's dog or a friend. Even the dark scares me sometimes, but not dark forests or anything like that. I'm a pagan, and spirituality, nature, and feeling connected to the earth are very important to me. So, most of the time, I only feel at ease when I'm outside. So, when I'm in nature and feel uneasy or scared, I always think it's for a good reason. I never ignore it. I get home from work around 10:30 p.m., which is pretty late. The whole trip back home, I felt very uneasy when I got to the top of the mountain, and I didn't want to get out of my car and walk to my house. I'm afraid of skinwalkers and other entities, and I know that makes them come to me. So I try to get rid of those thoughts as soon as they come to me, but they always come back, and that night was no different. But I thought my fear was justified. I didn't want to spend another second outside. So I got out of my car and ran back to my door. I was so scared. It was that horrible feeling you get when you turn around and think something bad is about to happen. Nothing happened, so I went to bed and locked my doors. In the morning, the night was like any other. But when I went outside, I saw a piece of bone near the porch of my house. I'm not saying it was a person, I think it was probably an animal. It looked like a big piece of bone, but it was just a small piece, probably from a deer. I know I live near coyotes and other predators, so there's probably a good reason why the bone was dry and didn't have any meat or blood on it. It was also old. It was just strange that this thing appeared overnight when it hadn't been there the day before. I don't have a dog in this house. I just had a weird feeling the night before, and then the bone was creepy. Last night, my boyfriend and I were on our way to a campsite on a small mountain in central Arkansas to meet his parents. It was dark when we got there, and the roads to the forest were pretty windy. As we passed a small field with tall grass on the side of the road, I saw some eyes reflecting light, but they were so bright it was almost like they were lights themselves. I've never seen the eyes of a normal animal shine like this. It was strange. The grass was pretty tall, so I could only see the head, but it looked like something was literally bouncing through the field. I didn't see any eyes or ears, so I didn't think it had any. It didn't look like any animal with 4 legs based on how it stood. Instead, it looked like it might have been on 2 feet. We thought it might have been a deer, but a few minutes later we saw some real deer, and it didn't look like them at all. They were much smaller, and the light didn't shine through their eyes. I didn't get a good look at this thing because I only saw it for a few seconds, but it was just weird. My brain didn't spend much time trying to figure out what it was. It just went straight to fear. That thing isn't normal, so get away from it. There have also been cases of people going missing in the area that fit the description of skinwalkers. My boyfriend's uncle has seen more than one Sasquatch on this mountain, but that doesn't really have anything to do with this story. So there are more mysterious creatures here. Do you think we saw a skinwalker? Last year, I lived in a small town with an interesting layout. The fronts of the houses faced each other, but instead of streets, the front doors led to paths that looked like park walkways. The back of each house opened onto a street that looked like a horseshoe. One area was in the middle of a few apartment buildings, So it had a playground, a basketball court, and all that other fun stuff. Around 1 in the morning, I went for a walk to smoke a joint. So I go to where the court is, sit on a bench, and smoke a cigarette. When you've been smoking for maybe 3 minutes, I look to my left and see two very tall shapes about 20 yards away, right under a streetlight. They are standing still and you can't tell what they look like. They are black, but not like a shadow person or a morph suit. They are taking in the light, and the heat. I can tell they are looking at me because I can feel the hate and the certainty that if they got any closer, my life would probably never be the same again. Now, it takes a lot to make me feel scared. But what I felt was pure, basic fear. I've seen dozens of ghosts and never been scared of them. This was like looking the devil straight in the eye and feeling his pure, undiluted hatred. It took me 10 minutes of being frozen with fear before I could get up and run out of there. While I was looking at them, they didn't move, make any sounds, or show any other sign that they were alive. I haven't seen that since, but it made me look up shadow people and similar things. According to people with more experience and knowledge, they weren't shadow people because of how tall they were, how dark they were, and how I felt around them. Instead, they were demons and evil. So that's my little hellish story. I see shadow people all the time and have for most of my life. It got worse when I moved in with my boyfriend. I never told him about them, but he would tell me he would see someone standing there out of the corner of his eye, but when he looked, they were gone. One of the shadow people I see all the time is one that goes by our window at night. I saw it all the time when I lived with my boyfriend, but I never told him about it. I noticed him quickly turning his head to look out the window at night while we were watching TV. He eventually told me that he keeps seeing something pass by the window, but it never made a sound because our window was open and there were lots of dry leaves and twigs in that part of the yard. It's not the headlights making shadows, because it will be completely dark outside the window. Instead, something even darker is just passing through. I've only seen two, and neither was on a flat surface. When my friends and I were driving around looking at abandoned houses, we passed an occupied house that gave them both a creepy feeling. I went back several times to show other friends, and the first two of these, the house is about 40 feet from the street, and there are many low, bushy plants in the yard. The first time we did a T-turn in front of us, a person-shaped shadow with a flat back and no reflection walked through our headlight beams about 10 feet in front of us, in front of some bushes and behind others. Our headlights reflecting off the house showed us the figure. We could tell how far away it was by how big it was compared to the house and how it was in the middle of bushes that were just above its knees. The second time I drove by, I saw a boat and a truck parked next to the house, with the house's floodlight shining right at them. This time, the figure walked in front of the truck and boat toward the house. When it got there, it either vanished or walked through the side of the house. On my later trips there, I didn't see anything unusual for almost a decade. One shadow person, who in hindsight seemed to be a man, used to stand by my mom's bed and make me go to sleep. He would stop me from reading books by being basically so distracting and then scary. I couldn't fall asleep until I left the light on or put the covers over my head. He was about the size of an adult and looked like an oval with soft edges. He didn't move much. He mostly only sat in two places next to the bed. Once, when I was about 4 years old, I saw several clear shadows of people on the wall. They looked like people waiting for a subway train or moving around in front of a painting at a museum. I don't think this is something new. I feel like I've read about something like this before, if anyone knows. They looked like they were keeping an eye on my family and me. We were all sleeping at my grandparents' small house, So we made a bed out of blankets and pillows on the living room floor. My dad and brother had already gone to bed. I sat up straight and just looked at them and us. They looked very casual and at ease as they walked around and talked. They looked a lot like the silhouettes of people who were still alive. I also had the feeling they didn't realize I could see them. Anyway, I eventually got up and found my mom in the kitchen. She asked me why I was still awake, and I told her I was watching the people on the wall. People are watching us from the wall. What? You didn't see that, so go lay down. My mom was scared of something that wasn't a person, but I just saw a ghost cat. I was walking toward my bedroom in the dark when I saw a small shadow that looked like a football move past my feet and in front of me. It moved like a playful cat, bouncing left, right, and left. I was surprised and confused at first, but then I thought it was the cutest ghost ever. I remember having a dream where I was outside at night on the street where I used to live. The street lights lit up the road in the usual orange color, and in my dream, I saw a lot of shadow people walking on the other side of the street from where I was standing on the sidewalk. All I could do was act like nothing was strange. I remember seeing them everywhere, but they didn't pay attention to me or do anything. All I could see were shadows that looked like people. When I was about 8 years old, I saw a shadow person in my great-aunt's house. We were all outside saying our goodbyes when I looked up into a bedroom window on the second floor and saw a shadowy figure with its back to me. The shadow moved quickly to the left, as if it were being pulled that way. If that makes any sense. It was like the shadow's chest was moving everything. It was very strange. And when I thought about how the house was set up, I realized that the shadow would have gone into a closet. I have seen them since I can remember. When I was a kid, I had one that never changed. So much so that I tried to feed them. My mom says that when I was in high school, I would drop raisins in the air while trying to feed someone. I would get very angry and yell that I wasn't going to waste my raisins if they weren't even going to try. When we moved into the house, they were everywhere. My friends saw one sitting at the foot of my bed in the middle of the night and just staring at her. Someone else saw it go down our hallway toward my room. My sister and I called him Sergeant Pepper because he always smelled like freshly ground black pepper and wore a hat with a wide brim. When we would see him, my dog would always be looking at a bright orange orb. I have a picture of this somewhere. On Christmas, my dad was in that house and saw a woman in white. Another friend saw a little boy playing with blocks in our living room, but he was gone when she came to get me. A ghost who liked to look in my sister's window was always seen in that house. She would just stand there and watch it while I ran outside. When I got close, she said, it would turn its head and run away. We had a yard with a fence and a dog, but it wasn't a person. Now that I've moved, there's no proof that shadow people were behind any of the other things that happened in that house. Most of the time I see them from a distance, usually in our parking lot. Sometimes I think it's just a trick of the light until my boyfriend tells me he just saw someone hiding behind a car. I was walking out the back door of my parents' house when I turned my head just a little and saw the door open and a shadow run through it and down the stairs to my right. I was sure that my brother ran down to the basement to get a beer. After that, I had to go down and check. No one was there, and he didn't answer. I know it sounds stupid, but I saw it in the right half of my vision, not out of the corner of my eye. It was about 4 feet tall. Amorphous, but with sharp edges. The best way to describe the ICP logo is as a person drawn like a jolt or without an axe. For those who don't know what a jolt is, it's a creature with long, thin legs and arms. Ian is a jolt. Ian is a Pokemon named J-O-L-T-O-N Jolt, which you can look up on Google. Later that night, Ian noticed that the soap and lotion bottles next to the sink had moved themselves off the counter. I did the move again a dozen times to make sure. Before or after this night, I didn't do anything to push them. I don't know what to think about it except that I saw it, and I don't know what to do with the information now. At the time, I was about 8 years old and slept in bunk beds. My sister is below me. When I woke up, I looked at my door and saw a shape that looked like a witch. The Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz, played by Shirley Temple Black, had a pointy hat, a pointy nose, and fingers that looked like claws. It moved slowly and smoothly toward my bed until it got to the little ladder. I was afraid and didn't know what to do. I was holding my Wicked Warlock teddy bear and felt ready to do something. I grabbed Wicked by his legs and swung at the shadow's head while yelling, "Go away." It just stopped being there. There was no swirling mist or anything. It was never seen again. I think that the mental and physical abuse is why I saw this shadow. At the time, my mother had begun to hurt me and my sister. I also think I developed a fear of total darkness at this age. When I'm alone and there's no light, I always feel like I'm being watched. I tried astral projection 4 years ago, and I almost did it on the first try. I also tried other paranormal things, like talking to ghosts, using Ouija boards and so on. Until I woke up one night, I would go after MIT was open between 2 and 4 a.m. to see a shadow that burned like a black fire, which is about all I can say about it. I recently watched the 2013 remake of Evil Dead again, and this drawing from the movie made me think of it. When I saw it, I couldn't breathe. I remember starting to kick while I was gasping for air because it was choking me. Then I fell asleep. But, strangely, I didn't know what to think when I woke up the next day. I was wondering what the hell went on last night. At first, I couldn't remember it, but then I did remember it right away. It was strange. Maybe something more happened that night. But needless to say, I never experimented with that again since first time I was 10 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked at my door, and there was a shadow person standing there in the hallway. I used to sleep with the door open and I could clearly see the outline of it. It was static, though the outline was clear but shifted, like there was an interference in what I was seeing. I could tell I was being watched and looked at, but there was no facial features, just a black mass in the shape of a person. The figure darted to the left of the door frame and entered the living room. I could hear its footsteps, oddly enough. It came back, then stopped in my doorway again before going down the hall towards my parents' room. I got up to look, and of course nothing. I sleep with my door closed now. I never saw it again in that house. I heard it though walking through the house many times. It wasn't until I moved into my current place that I saw them again, this time much more frequently. I see them every few weeks or so now. They don't bother me. I don't bother them. We simply coexist. Once on vacation with my family, I woke up in the middle of the night for some reason, and I hear someone at the door. The resort rooms were in a motel style where you were outside before you went in. The bed I was in was closest to the door, and I was on the edge of the bed near it. I watched as the door handle started to jiggle a little, and I didn't know what to think. I looked behind me and saw each one of my family members in bed asleep. I knew I was awake, and I knew it was not one of them. The door started to open, and I just stared. A black figure started gliding towards me slowly. It became right to the edge of the bed in front of me and reached its arms out to me. I just stared up at it, terrified, and told me, "Come with me." I didn't move or say anything. I just kept staring. It then started to move backwards, and then I started shaking my sister next to me aggressively, saying, "Do you see it? /S, do you see that?" And I kept looking back at it while trying to wake her up. Right as she woke up, it disappeared into a dark corner. It still scares me to think about it. I was on a hometown vacation with my mom and granny. What the hell on earth was woken me up in the middle of the night? The light was killed, and then I sensed something weird. I checked that my mom and granny were still sleeping in nets while someone or something stood in front of the edge of my bed. It was a pitch black entity. It put me on a negative state of frightening. I couldn't do a single movement until it came towards me, and then I screamed out, waking everybody up. They put on the light, and see nothing now. My mom was pissed off and blamed that one of my imaginary friends, since I used to be an imaginative kid, but I swear it's real, not a nightmare. I don't know if it matters, but I live in the corner of all my neighboring townhouses. It's a 2-story house, and I have a yard and a parking parallel to my yard. One half of the house is not attached to anything. The other side is a neighboring 1-story house. I can clearly see the parking lot 15 yards away from my bedroom window. So I'm super close to my vehicle. July 2017. On a Monday, I was taking a shower in Miami, Florida. In my townhouse, I could hear a TV novella, kind of like the Spanish programming or Family Feud, with lots of cheering and talking. I don't ever watch novellas. So I look over my balcony after I dry myself off, and all the lights are off. At first I thought it was my dad or my brother because we are roommates in a 3-bedroom, but I was alone. I just went back in my room and played piano Tuesday. I heard the TV show cheering again, but now followed by footsteps going up or down the stairs. I couldn't tell. I get out wet and pray somebody is home. No one is home though? All the lights are off and my TV's off downstairs, so I go in my room and seclude myself and play video games again. Wednesday I hear the same as yesterday. I run all the way downstairs and grab my sharp $100 kitchen knife, run through each room looking for some intruder. I check everything except the attic in my dad's bedroom, because it's tiny and frankly there's no ladder. I go in my room, set my alarm for work, and my blinds are wide open so I could see my black Cadillac Escalade. I swear on my sister's life I see a trench-coated fedora wearing man near my car but not touching it, and at first I don't think anything paranormal. I thought it was a neighbor walking by because of how close the houses are and the street lamp is pretty bright, but then I noticed them not moving. So I began to think they are looking inside of my car trying to case it and steal something, but I get closer to the window and notice its shoulders aren't facing towards my car. It's facing towards me and standing unnaturally still. I dialed my girl with the phone still in hand and keep staring at it to make sure I'm not hallucinating. I look away and look back, but it's still there. I explained to her, babe, I think someone is trying to steal from my car but they're not moving. It feels very eerie, she says, to make sure all my doors are locked in case they're trying to break into my place. But why are they wearing a trench coat? It's human as hell. In Florida, you can literally sweat outside at night time just being naked. I look at the clock and realize I have been staring at someone standing still for 2 entire minutes, 120 seconds. I go downstairs, check every door again. I have an even bigger window downstairs facing my parking lot, but I don't see anybody standing by my car. I look at my oven and notice it's around 10 and either my brother or dad will get home soon. So I tell that to my girlfriend, run upstairs and lock my door with my knife in my room. I leave every light in my house on. At this point I don't see the fedora user by my caddy anymore, and I do feel relief but stress. So I sit down, blast my speakers and start playing games. I paused my music and continue speaking to my girl and tell her that, babe, people say that you can't be a pussy in front of ghosts. Supposedly they feed off fear, and if I continue to be scared of them, they will. In the middle of me saying they will feed off my fear, I could feel a cold finger or object run up my spine from the crack of my behind up to my neck very slowly. If I could estimate it would be 15 seconds to travel, and it was as if something super cold like a finger sitting in ice was touching me from the inside of my body as the 15 seconds pass while it's running up my spine. I start hearing a loud pitch getting louder and louder. My speakers are muted by the way, so it wasn't coming from them as it finally reaches my neck. I feel a chill come down on my body like I have never before. I'm from Florida, but I've been in the snow before, and that was colder and stiffer than freezing temperatures. Then my book bag on my bed goes flying out the window that looks out towards my Cadillac. I turn my head with both hands on my piano and my head hugging my shoulder because I'm on the phone with my girl and see most of the shutter closed by something hitting it. I peek on the side of the bed and see my book bag upside down, and fear comes over my body like a warm blanket. I run out of the room in boxers and a tank top, struggling to grab pants. So I frustratingly just grab the blanket and run outside barefooted on the phone, still sitting in the table between my house and my car, and waited for an hour for my family to get home. My family laughed at me afterward, and then they made jokes about being in my underwear. My dad's side of the family is involved in Santeria. So, my dad went to my aunt's house right away to get some sage as spanter. They make Santeria chalk and moretto from a plant in their backyard. We clean the house with sage. Our family's psychic told us to draw crosses on the inside and outside of every kind of doorway. Even if it's my attic or a closet that leads nowhere, the chalk used in Santeria is made from chicken eggs. I'm not sure if that information is important, but I'll leave it here anyway. We got about 10 vases and filled each one with a cup and a half of water and an equal number of fake daisies. We put a vase in each room, including the bathrooms, because Santa Muerto means scare the dead, and people use it to figure out if there are ghosts in the house without EMF meters. We put them in each room and went to bed on Wednesday. When we woke up on Thursday, all of the plants except the one in my brother's room were still alive. It was completely dead to me and my dad, which makes sense because he had fought with my dad a week before. He had been looking for a job for 4 months, but my dad wanted him to help pay rent, so he kept putting off interviews. My dad finally got fed up with him and told him he needed to leave or get a job. They both yelled at each other, and he ended up saying that he's 23 years old and has no idea what he wants to do with his life. And he has been looking for graphic design or logo design jobs for other people. So he wouldn't have to work at McDonald's and spend time with his girlfriend. Early in 2017, he broke up with him, which made him sad. He told my dad he wanted to kill himself, and then he fell into my dad's arms. So my dad also started to cry. They sat down together and made a plan for him to get a job, which he did. But I say this because every time he came home, he was alone in that room, which had a lot of bad energy. It turned out that room failed the false daisy test. We kept all the flowers, except for the ones in my brother's room, and they stayed alive after that. I've never felt like someone was close by when I was home alone. All game show sounds and footsteps have stopped for now. I want to astral project eventually, but at least I'm scared now, and we'll try to control the fear they give me. For the week of faith. I'm a transgender Chinese American woman who is 51 years old. I was born in Pennsylvania but moved to Arizona when I was 20 and lived there for 5 years. After these things, they are moving back to the east. I don't believe in ghosts, magic, or anything strange. But after living in Arizona, I do believe in skinwalkers. I don't know if one of them was following me or if I just had the bad luck to run into more than one. I only know that strange things happened and that skinwalkers were the only explanation I could find. I also know that I will never go back to Arizona. I'm not an American Indian. So I'm not sure if skinwalker is even the right name for what I've seen. But if you have a different opinion, please tell me right away. This was the first week I lived in Santa Cruz County. For my first place, I rented a small house. People here didn't know much about me because I moved around a lot. All they knew was that I was a normal girl with no secrets. Yes, I've had a lot of work done, including SRS, but I've been told it looks very natural. The only thing that doesn't look right is my lips, which are very misshapen from some blotchy lip fillers I had in the past. At the time, nobody I met in Arizona knew I was transgender. I don't talk to my parents anymore, who are traditional Chinese, and I haven't seen them since I was 15. My sister came to see me often, but one night she came to my house and was smoking a cigarette while we talked on the porch. She told me that her father had asked to see pictures of me, but she had turned him down. He doesn't accept my transition, and even though he gets along well with her, she won't let him into my life, since he doesn't want to be there. He does, however, sometimes try. She made fun of his voice to make me laugh by saying in Mandarin, "I want to see his picture," over and over again while pointing at me. Every time he called me a man, he did the same thing. Even in everyday conversations, as if that would be enough to convince me I was a man. After she left my house to go to the airport, we laughed about it and kept talking. It was getting dark when I heard someone knock on the back porch door. Even though she had left only 2 hours before, my sister was still there without her car in front. By the way, she was smoking a cigarette while holding a pack of Marlboros. Just waiting outside the door. People know that my sister only smokes Camels. I opened the door, but I stayed inside. I thought she would come in, but she just stood there. We looked at each other, and for some reason I got goosebumps. She looked more tired than she had since before she had my nephew. She said, "I want to see his picture," in Chinese, and pointed at me. I looked at her hand because I usually do that when someone makes a gesture. Her verse sounded like she was drunk. I noticed that her feet were very ugly. She said it again in Mandarin. But this time, she said the wrong thing. Like when you try to teach someone who speaks English how to say something and they repeat it with the wrong sounds emphasized. I didn't know what to do. But after a night of drinking, keep in mind that I was not yet an alcoholic at this point in my life. I didn't drink much and could get drunk after just 1 or 2 drinks. After the encounters started, I started drinking, but I've been sober for over 20 years now. I really thought I was having a strange dream. It felt like real life, and I had been watching TV before the doorbell rang, but I knew it wasn't because of how her feet looked. I shut the door behind me and went back to bed. I woke up in the same clothes and hairstyle as the night before, which is very unusual for me. Before I go to bed, I always braid my hair and put on one of my silk night dresses. Right away, I got a chill up my spine, and I called my sister right away. She had gotten an earlier flight home because the pilot of her original flight got sick, and at the airport, people were switching flights and tickets with the airline or other passengers. The next day, she had to go to my nephew's baseball game. So, a woman gave my sisters her ticket for the next day so they wouldn't have to wait at the airport. She got on a plane an hour before her original one. After she left, I didn't fall asleep, and it was clear that the only reason I went to bed after closing the door was because I didn't believe in ghosts but liked scary stories on the radio or TV. I was scared, but I knew she wasn't at my house, so I thought I must have been seeing things. I made it a habit to lock the porch door, and when I found out it was a skinwalker a few years later, it made me want to quit smoking. I can't think about smoking the same way anymore. I did not quit. Straight up. Second time, I had been drinking all night at a bar. I had planned to have just 1 or 2 more drinks before my friend picked me up to drive me home. But this very attractive man named David sat down and started hitting on me. He had a lot of charm and was funny. I had a lot of fun. He asked me to go home and sleep with him, but I politely said no because I'm transgender and prefer to keep that a secret. Even after SRS, I still make sure to tell any man I'm dating or sleeping with that my birth sex is male. This is especially true if I've only known him for a few hours and was drunk and didn't know what he thought about transgender people. I wasn't going to tell him, of course. He told me he understood and asked me if I was okay with his friend, who worked at the bar as a waitress, driving me home. I said sure. I called my friend and told her that I didn't need a ride. We had drinks and talked until the woman's shift was over. He walked me to the door and kissed my hand, then asked me to call him later to set up another date. That night, I felt like a princess and slept like a baby. I didn't call him that day because I wanted to wait until the third day. I don't know if girls still do this, but when I was young, we would wait 3 days before calling a suitor back so that he would be waiting for us. He'll be happy to hear from you. Anyway, I thought about him the whole day. That night, he was a dreamboat for sure. At 6 p.m. I heard the door being banged on. David did it. He just stood there with a face that looked like he was on drugs and beat on the door with both fists, even though there was no car in the driveway or in front of the house. I thought it might be because I hadn't called him back right away. So I called the police. As soon as I started talking on the phone, his head turned sharply. It looked like it hurt. He looked at me from the window and never stopped slamming it. For some reason, all I could think about was how my sister had died a few months before, and I got goosebumps again. I also thought his nose looked different when I was one bar stool away from him and when I was right next to him. But I had been drinking a lot when I saw him. So I might have been wrong. It looked much bigger than I remembered, and it was very red and swollen, with blood coming out of both nostrils. But the blood also looked funny. I don't know why it looked weird, but when I turned on the light above my door to see who was there, it didn't shine red. I told the police that a man I met at a bar last night was violently knocking on my door in a way that made me think he wanted to hurt me. They said a police officer was on the way and to stay on the line. I asked how long it would take, and the skinwalker I thought was David closed his eyes in a way that looked like he was trying to squeeze them shut. I'll never forget how his hands stopped moving right in front of the door, just as they were about to hit it. Out of the blue, he turned around and walked back down the street in a straight line. He wasn't in a rush, and he walked funny. At the bar, I didn't notice that. It looked like he knew the police were coming and gave up. I told the person on the phone and hid in my kitchen until the police officer showed up. He looked angry and said, "I didn't file a police report against David because I was afraid he would find out and come back. I just wanted to be done with it. When I was younger, men beat me up because I was transgender." A week later, I saw David walking around town again, and he smiled at me and walked over to say hello with a happy look on his face. He looked like I remembered him from the bar, not from my house, but I was still scared. I started to cry, and I told him very loudly to stay away from me. He looked hurt and confused. But he said sorry and left quickly, without a limp. He was nice at the bar and when he was out on the town. Even just him saying my name. I felt the same way in the bar, and if what I now think was a skinwalker hadn't acted strangely in my house, I would have been happy to talk to him after I learned about them. Even if it was crazy, I wanted to call his number. But I wanted to explain why I yelled at him when we ran into each other in town even though I had yelled at him years before. Even now, I still sometimes feel like he was the one who got away. After I saw David again, I was afraid he would come back to the house. At this point, I wouldn't let him learn about skinwalkers for a few more weeks. So I made up my mind to get a dog. My landlord told me he wouldn't let me have one. So I put it off until I moved. I moved to Pima County, which is just outside of Tucson. Even though I don't believe the stereotypes about pit bulls, I got one because I hoped David would if he ever saw me again. His name was Fang, but I called him Fango Mango. I called him Fang for the first few days, but then I changed it to just Mango because he was the nicest dog ever and started responding to that name more than Fang. He had bad owners before, and when he was a puppy, he was used in dog fights. He was very scared of himself because a big piece of his left ear was missing. He was afraid of dogs and people. When he had to go to the bathroom late at night, he made me feel a lot safer and happier. So I let him out and went to get some water. I heard him growling and whimpering all of a sudden. It sounded like he saw another dog and was afraid it would attack him. I had to look out the window to see what was going on. He was whining in the middle of the yard, and the other dog was out of sight. I've heard him cry around the other dog before, but this time it was different. So I thought he might have been hurt. Usually, when he was scared, he would close his eyes with his paws, but in the yard, his eyes were open and he was looking at the door, not where the other dog was. I ran to the door, opened it, and called his name. He ran toward me. I was watching Mango run toward the door when all of a sudden he ran into my legs. I slammed it shut without even thinking about what was going on. The dog was running, but then it ran headfirst into the door. Mango stood between me and the door and started growling. He had never growled before. I ran to the window, but he was standing at the door scratching at it, like he wanted to get out and kill the other dog. He scratched so hard that it had left marks on the door. He turned around and ran away. When I saw something strange, the missing piece of ear was now on the right side instead of the left, and his tail looked like it had been stung by a lot of bees. The next day, I went to the store and bought Mango a steak as a reward for being such a good guardian against the other dog. I haven't eaten meat since I was 12, so I pretty much cooked Helen's meal for her. But when I gave him the burned pieces that had been cut up, he didn't seem to mind. The other dog had also scratched the door, but his marks were nothing like the ones the real Mango had made on the inside. I didn't mind that my landlord made me pay for a new door. Because he would say rude things about me, I finally left. Fourth meeting. This is the first time I've met someone who made me feel like what had happened before fit together. The eyes are both blank and open. The weird way that the one that spoke and the one that whimpered sounded so real at first, but when I listened to them again, they sounded wrong in a way. The weird differences up to this point, like the feet, nose, ear, and tail, and the fact that they were all around the same time at night. Anyway, I took Mango for a walk in the evening this time, and even though it was still light out, it got dark pretty quickly. I still lived in a rural area. I was only a few blocks from where I used to live. Since the new house didn't have a yard, I had to walk him more than once a day. Each day when I got him, he was a pretty old dog. At this time, he would have been around 11 years old. My neighbor called my name, so I turned to see where she was so I could say hello. She sounded like she had a lisp when she said S, which she didn't usually have, but I couldn't see her from where I was because of the bushes. A coyote ran at me from the desert. Mango jumped in front of me and growled. He grabbed it by the body and the mouth and slammed it to the ground. He had never growled before when he was near me. When the skinwalker looked like him, it was the only time he had ever growled. The sound came from his teeth, but there was no blood on it. Its fur was barely moved, and its muzzle was too big for its face, as if it had been drawn out of proportion. The tail was all bent up and looked like it had been broken more than once. It was clear that the animal wasn't thinking straight because instead of running away, it turned around right away and attacked the mango. I tried to get him away from the coyote. Even though it was a warm night, the coyote was cold to the touch, and it bit me very hard on the arm. I still have a small scar from when it happened. I had never felt pain like that before. It felt like my whole arm was on fire, and I could see that the bite mark was still pulsing even though I had been viciously attacked and was still being attacked. Still, the mangoes tried to fight off the coyote. I thought I was going to faint. I felt so sick that I fell to the ground, but I forced myself to stay awake so I could help my dog, Mango. Mango bit the coyote on the face or neck, and it screamed like a human man would, not like any of the hurt coyote sounds I've heard online. Before it left, I watched it run away. It turned around, looked me in the eyes, and showed me its teeth in a way that made it look like it was smiling at me. Once again, it made me feel like all the other times. I picked up Mango and cried over him, even though he was hurting. He licked my face. His beautiful gingerbread man was covered in blood and coyote bites, and he not only threw up on me, but he also started having seizures and started pooping and peeing all over. By the time animal control and a vet came to help, he was already dead. I went to the hospital because I got bit, and in the waiting room I had to get 13 stitches. In fact, I had my very first seizure. I had them all the time. I lived in Arizona the rest of the time, and I haven't had one since I left and never went back. The wound didn't heal for weeks and got infected more than once. The coyote wasn't rabid because neither of us saw any signs of rabies or other diseases that coyotes carry. Losing Mango sent me into a deep depression, and I went to a therapist to deal with my grief. She forced me to go to the hospital, where I was diagnosed with PTSD and schizophrenic because I told them everything that happened and said that the coyotes were demons trying to hurt me. I stayed in the psychiatric ward for almost 2 months. After I got out of the hospital, I got a tattoo of a mango fruit to hide the scar from the coyote bite. I didn't know many people, especially women, who had tattoos, but I was proud to have one. The day my friend came to the hospital to pick me up, we saw a lone coyote. When I was in the hospital, I called the landlord, and when I got out, he helped me and my friends move all of my stuff. I never went back, and I even moved away. I wasn't at all religious, but at the time, the only thing I could think of was that a demon was making me feel bad. I should also say that a man I was dating at the time found a badly mutilated and half-rotten coyote corpse in front of his apartment 1 month into my stay at the hospital. He broke up with me over the phone because he thought that if I was crazy enough to be in a mental hospital, my friends were probably crazy enough to do something like that to him, and he said a lot of bad things about me trying to turn him gay. Fifth encounter. I had moved to a town between Florence and Globe because I wanted to start over. Even though the medicine was giving me really bad side effects, my outpatient psychiatrist told me not to stop taking it. My tattoo bite area started to feel like it was burning 3 months after I got out of the hospital. Not always, but sometimes, usually at night, and almost always right before a seizure. Another strange thing that happened to me while I lived in Arizona was this. Since I moved into my new apartment, that hasn't happened either. I had a cat named Slinky, and one day she ran away while I was at work. I started asking around if anyone had seen her, since I lived on the 4th floor and never let her out. So even if she left my apartment, someone had to take her somewhere so she wouldn't be on the floor. I heard from a neighbor that she helped my boyfriend. I asked her if she had seen my missing cat, and she looked shocked when I did. Even though I didn't have a boyfriend, I didn't send my non-existent boyfriend to take her somewhere so I could ask her about him. She said a Native American or maybe a Mexican man saw her in the hallway and walked up to her with an empty cat carrier. He asked her if she could call the building manager for him, because I asked him to take Slinky to the vet for me, but he forgot his key, or maybe he knew this. She was my neighbor and someone I was getting to know well. She also made my spare key. She opened the door. But before he went in, he got a call on his phone. He asked her to get Slinky for him, saying that Slinky was afraid of him, and went into the stairwell to talk on the phone. The man left that night after my neighbor put Slinky in the carrier. My wound hurt so much. I had a seizure in my bed, and when I checked my mail the next day, there was an envelope with just my first name on it. The only thing inside was a Slinky, which looked like it had been shaved off with electric hair clippers. I felt like a racist paranoid when I went to the library to look up Native American curses and strange things that had happened to them. A few days later, at work, I saw a cat in the parking lot next to my car that looked just like Slinky, except for its strangely shaped tail. It couldn't have been Slinky, though, because she had all her hair cut off. But it wasn't. It started walking toward me, so I got in my car and tried to run it over. Even if it was a skinwalker, it's not something I'm proud of. I changed direction at the last second because I couldn't kill it. I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but a few days later, a big hawk pecked at my window for over 2 hours until it started to rain. I see. I don't know, because I didn't think it was strange. My last pet was a Slinky named Slinky. The last time we met, I was walking down the street in Belis when a woman grabbed my arm and bit me. She actually looked like she had a stroke or something because half of her face was sagging and her eyes were still blank. I now worked with people I thought were skinwalkers, which gave me the same chills. My skin burned where she held me, and she said my birth name in a voice that almost sounded like a messed up recording. When I moved away, my skin was red and shaped like her hand. I asked her why she had been bothering me for so long, and she just repeated the name my parents gave me when I was born, but this time with the last name I had changed because I didn't want anyone to know she knew my old name. Even after telling people I'm transgender, I never give out my old name, much less the whole thing. I told her to kill me and be done with it, because I didn't want to live with fear, paranoia, and pain any longer. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but when she moved her lips, nothing came out. I ran to my car and left in it. I decided that day that I had to leave before this thing killed me. So my sister flew it to get me, and I packed up everything to move in with her for a few months on the East Coast. She said that while she was smoking outside the Safford Regional Airport, she saw a woman who looked just like her except for her lips and like she was wearing men's clothes. The same goes for everything else. I think it was after my sister. After a few years, it was confirmed that I wasn't schizophrenic, so I stopped taking the medicine. They wrote on a sticky note in my file at my therapist's office that I was hospitalized because I was having an episode of psychosis. People thought that was schizophrenia. My therapist told me she would do this. I really think a skinwalker was making me feel bad. If not the same one, a group of them. I'm afraid of animals, and when I meet someone new, I often look them in the eyes to see if they might be a skinwalker. I don't go out at night, and I got very drunk for a few years. I now have cancer of the liver. But my wonderful boyfriend has helped me stay clean and go to treatment. Because he loves me, he doesn't care if evil creatures curse me. But every day I worry that the skinwalker will leave Arizona and come find me or one of my teenage adopted daughters and kill us. I also think that the only reason I wasn't killed was because it was trying to bother me and thought that since I said I wanted to die, I would have won if it killed me. I think the natives have been here much longer than we have, so they know what kind of evil is in this land. I hope that, even if you nice people can't give me a possible explanation for what's happened to me in the past, you can at least give me hope. At least you can have fun with what I've told you. Sometimes. I think it's funny that even though I don't believe in ghosts, some of my favorite ghost stories are about things that are said to have happened in real life. I'd be grateful for any information anyone could give me, and I'd also like to hear from anyone who knows why it chose me. Thank you to everyone who has stopped by to listen.